Hello and welcome to the world today. This week we're going to discuss the rise of Germany. What has happened in Germany is not a surprise. People suddenly wake up because of the way the Germans have dealt with Greece and think that this is new. In fact, German hegemony has been developing over the last 2 decades and more. And once the reunification happened, it wasn't a huge surprise that Germany would become the major power inside the European continent. With me today is Mark Bergfeldt, who has written extensively on Germany over the last years and is currently a researcher at Queen Mary University in London. Mark, welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
When do you think German economic power actually began to develop and become what it is today, with all its weaknesses?
I think the very inception of the idea of Germany as an export-led economy begins in 1952 with the with French and German relations really tightening after World War II and having the European Iron and Steel Union, in which Germany and France continue to develop political relationships as well as economic relationships, basing their economic strength on export-led growth. What you see in subsequent years is that given that Germany was a divided country, that Germany always was too small to exercise full hegemony inside of Europe. However, its main exports tended to be placed inside of Europe and what would later become the European Union. I think the fall of the Berlin Wall signified not only that Germany would increase its workforce and its population from 60 million to roughly 80 to 82 million, but it also allowed it to privatize a lot of the formerly state-owned enterprises of the East, and effectively also have a much cheaper labor force in East Germany that it could strengthen its economy in the 1990s. What we see coming in the 2000s is that the Schröder government and the SPD, the Social Democratic and Green government, effectively launched a labor market reform, the Hartz IV reforms, which pressed down wages, which also attacked unemployment benefits and social wages and labor rights, and effectively was able to push down wages with a strong Deutschmark.
Hang on, Mark. What is commonly referred to as reforms in today's world, in the neoliberal world, by that we actually mean regressions, that all the gains, or many of the gains that had been achieved or granted to the German workforce during the Cold War years were now systematically being taken away, and not taken away by a right-wing conservative government, but taken away by German social democracy in alliance with the Greens. They are the party, the Social Democrats and the Greens, are the party which actually deprived the working class of many of its gains and achievements of previous years.
You are right. Whilst in Britain, Thatcherism was able to destroy the trade union movement through defeating the miners in 84-85, or whilst you saw Reagan defeating the air controller strike and unionization and a general neoliberal revolution taking place in those countries, Helmut Kohl, the German chancellor for more than 16 years, was not able to actually implement neoliberal labor market, so-called reforms, as you rightly point out. And interestingly, it was social democracy which introduced neoliberalism in Germany. And so we need to actually talk about non-reformist reforms, which hit the poorest and most vulnerable in society the hardest. And that is important to understand, because what the Schröder and the Green government did was not attack those very strong organized sections of the working class movement, but actually curtail unemployment benefits, force people out of their homes if their homes were seen to be too large for being on unemployment benefits, and making the kind of Victorian distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor, which we have seen take place in the United States, or we have seen take place in Britain previously as well.
Well, and the result of this was a very lopsided development with huge inequalities, so that today the inequalities in Germany are, I think, amongst the highest in the world between the rich and the poor, which was not the case, by the way. The inequality gap was not so big during the in the 50s, during the first economic boom.
The tendency of inequality developing in Germany really starts in 1998, and we see today that Germany is the most unequal society inside of the EU and inside of the Eurozone. And what we see in particular is that inequality is affecting children. So 1 out of 5 children lives in severe poverty, according to some reports. And to highlight that is the rise of food banks in Germany goes far beyond anything that we, for example, have seen in Britain. So 250,000 food banks in a country like Germany, one of the wealthiest countries in the global north, is absolutely shocking. And if we look at the labor force, is that before 1998, there was no such thing as atypical work, that most people were on permanent contracts, in steady jobs. They had trade union representation and co-determination, meaning that you had representation on management boards. What has happened since then is that we have seen a massive rise of precarious work, of insecure work, and now we see 2.8 million workers who work in such conditions, and 2.4 million people in Germany need to subsidize their work, their lives, with a second job. So we're seeing an Americanization taking place in Germany that we haven't witnessed before.
And how are the unemployment and employment statistics affected by this?
That is a very interesting question. So the labor market reforms sought to integrate those people who were in long-term unemployment back into the labor market through very vicious means, through means of forcing them to accept jobs for €1 an hour, or forcing them to move to the other end of the country. And so what we have seen is that on its own terms, those labor market, the Hartz IV labor market reforms have been successful in creating a low unemployment economy. Whereas in the early 2000s, there was talk of a Weimar Republic with more than 5 million unemployed German workers. We now see the lowest unemployment rates of about 2.1, 2.2 million workers, many of which, of course, are the people who work in those low-wage sectors that I've just...
But are counted as employed.
But are counted as employed.
So what we saw as Gerhard Schröder, the German SPD chancellor, began to push through neoliberal policies with the agreement of many of the large unions, a very senior figure in German social democratic politics, Oskar Lafontaine, effectively resigned his post because he was more of a left-wing Keynesian, did not want neoliberalism, and broke publicly with the SPD, denounced it both in relation to its economic policies and the war in Yugoslavia, which they were fought, to which we'll come in a minute. But he didn't just resign from this party. He created or helped to create the left party, Die Linke, which unified West and East Germany and became rapidly quite a strong force. I mean, winning 5%, 6%, 7% in the state elections, and ultimately 50 or 52 MPs in the German parliament. So it was a major development on the German left.
The creation of Die Linke, of the left party, is a historic breakthrough for the extra-parliamentary left in Germany and for left-wing forces beyond social democracy and beyond the SPD. If you imagine that the SPD was one of the bulwarks of social democracy for nearly 100 years, yeah. And you see suddenly a force to the left of it developing in Germany, where anti-communism was rampant, where the left had been sidelined through various impositions. And what we need to understand in the case of Oskar Lafontaine is that Oskar Lafontaine was one of the most prominent politicians in Germany, and one of the most popular politicians actually in Germany. And him breaking from the SPD is as if someone like Gordon Brown had broken away from
to
the left, had broken away from the Labour Party. And him going into forming the Electoral Coalition for Social Justice and Equality, the WASG, signified that in West Germany, for the first time, there was a left alternative to the SPD. And as you rightly point out, it quickly won 5%, 6% on the basis that the demonstrations and the movement against the Hartz IV reforms were one of the biggest social movements that we have seen in reunified Germany. Often, I remember being on demonstrations as a teenager with 10,000s of people on a Monday evening in Cologne. We have seen how in German cities from Stuttgart all the way to Berlin, tens of thousands of people demonstrated against the Hartz IV reforms, unemployment groups, the left of the trade unions, and that also formed the basis initially of Die Linke, together with what was the former East German Communist Party, the PDS.
How would you say Die Linke has developed? Because it's been up and down.
The Die Linke has developed in three respects. The first is that it continuously polls very well. So on the terms of a parliamentary party acting in Germany, trying to seek representation for working class people, for unemployed, for students, against the war, it has polled very well. We've recently seen in 2013 Die Linke becoming the main opposition party, the third strongest force in German politics. We have seen it consistently maintain become the strongest party in East Germany, where we now have Bodo Ramelow as the Prime Minister of the federal state of Thuringia, and we see a possibility of a number of other East German states actually being led by a left party minister. And we have seen Die Linke entering into a number of West German parliaments like Hessen as the main opposition party. That's on one. The second part is that it actually has built sustained relationships with the social movements in Germany. So it hasn't only looked to itself in terms of how do we win elections, but it also has played a significant role inside of the Blockupy movement, which were the demonstrations against the opening of the European Central Bank. It has continued to play a role in mobilizing its members and mobilizing supporters against the fascists marching in Dresden on the anniversary of the Dresden bombing of 1943. And so we have seen it play a role, a limited but yet a role inside of the social movements, which is a very significant development given the way that the SPD just used to tell its members, just vote for us and we'll do it for you, and instead Die Linke actively plays a role. And on the third respect, it's inside of the trade union movement. Die Linke's leader Bernd Rixinger has said that we want to go beyond the kind of gap between parliamentary politics and economics and trade unionism on the one hand, and so Die Linke has played an active role in bringing together trade unionists who have gone on strike recently, organizing a number of big workshops, renewal through strike, together with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. And so we have seen it intervene inside of debates around the 35-hour week, reduction of working hours in Germany, around issues such as precarious work conditions. And so even though it is limited to what it can do, it still has tried to overcome some of the initial problems that social democracy had developed over the years.
Well, this is a very glowing account, and you're right, but there is another side which we shouldn't ignore, which is that one detects occasionally in the utterances of Gregor Gysi, in particular, one of the main leaders of the left party, a desire to embrace social democracy. And given what social democracy has become, not just in Germany and Britain, but more or less globally, don't you think that any attempt to play down one's own politics in return for power here, there, or either on the state level or on the federal level could prove to be pretty disastrous?
You're absolutely right that whenever Die Linke has entered a government, it continuously has lost voters. So when it was in a coalition with the SPD in Berlin, it lost 10,000 voters after ending its term in office. We can hope that the same will not happen again in Thuringia. However, the party is really divided on the question. So what you see in West Germany is a type of oppositional politics where members and supporters of Die Linke vote for Die Linke on the basis of saying, in order to have a social consciousness inside of parliament, we vote Die Linke as a pure opposition. Whilst in the East, people actually have the idea that we can change things by being in power and having a left-wing government. But because of the way that German politics is structured and the way that there's impositions on the federal state level to not create any new debts or to not follow any Keynesian politics, it makes it impossible for them even to launch large investment programs, big social programs as Die Linke. And so Die Linke is caught between those two wings. For Gregor Gysi himself, this becomes a rhetorical game where whenever he sees the opportunity that the SPD might want to go into a coalition in 2017, he openly tries to steer the party into that direction. When he sees the SPD retreating and moving closer and closer to the CDU, to the conservatives, he goes into oppositional mode. And I think it looks very likely that a majority of green SPD-Linke is going to be possible in the future. The question remains unresolved in Die Linke whether Die Linke will actually go into such a government.
Let's come to German foreign policy. Throughout the Cold War years, of course, Germany was divided. West Germany was very firmly in the camp of the West. How could it not be? It was de facto a US protectorate. With the unification of Germany, its sovereignty increased somewhat, but it exercises this sovereignty very, very carefully. It rarely breaks with the United States. It has been getting the German army and air force used to fighting wars, and so all the inhibitions began to be removed, and then Germany, of course, played a big part in the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. It opposed the Iraq War, which won Schroeder the election, but for very opportunist reasons. And immediately, once Iraq was occupied, the Germans were on board, recognized the occupation, had investments, etc. So this shift very clearly to move closer to the NATO mainstream, as far as foreign policy was concerned, didn't create much of an opposition. I remember very well in Germany the huge demonstrations against the stationing of Pershing missiles in that country. But when it went to war in Afghanistan or Yugoslavia, the mood had clearly changed. The German peace movement had declined, and the role of the Greens and Joschka Fischer, in particular in defending that war, was atrocious.
Yeah, it's important to state that after the reunification of Germany, and ever since, Germany has been stuck in a bit of a dilemma. On the one hand, it's too big for Europe. On the other hand, it's too small for the world. And so what we see is that Germany started to regain confidence in terms of becoming an international actor through the European Union, in terms of Europe, and exercising its hegemony, and through its coalition with the United States and NATO on a global level. And as you rightly point out, 1999, led by the Green government, Green SPD government, German troops went onto foreign soil for the first time since the Third Reich. And that ultimately signifies a break for the Green Party, where many members left disenfranchised from the Green Party, and the Green Party no longer was seen as, or ever since has been seen as, a party for peace and an anti-war party. On the other hand, it legitimized German interventions inside of the mainstream discourse. And continuously we see how foreign ministers and defense ministers are making greater appeals, particularly from the Conservative Party, to become a more aggressive global player. The point being, when it comes to 2003 and to the Iraq War, I think that signifies the way that US-German relations really have developed, and the way that, and it gives us a glimpse of the way they are constituted. On the one hand, we saw the rise of the so-called Berlin, Moscow, Paris axis of the kind of forces which were against the Iraq War. Rhetorically, and Schröder actually making a very brilliant anti-war speech, which will be in the memories of many young people during that time, and as you rightly point out, won him the elections. On the other hand, though, Germany, as parliamentary inquiries have shown, actually allowed the US to use Ramstein Air Base and other air bases inside of Germany as a launching pad for attacks onto Iraq, and also had intelligence services inside of Iraq. So the fact that Germany wasn't involved in the war in Iraq is false, and we should actually make a point of it that they have been involved.
They didn't send troops.
They didn't send ground troops.
In the 60s and early 70s, there was not this unconditional support for Israel on the German left. I mean, I used to attend German SDS conferences and meetings of the German left, where very critical views of Israel were expressed, and support for the Palestinians. I mean, you know, it's not considered right in polite society to talk about the Baader-Meinhof group, but whether we like it or not, they had the support at one point of 25% of the German population, which is a huge figure. And one reason for that was their unremitting hostility to fascist remnants embedded in German society and the German state apparatus. That was clear. They went about combating them in a completely crazy way, in my opinion. I said as much to their leaders when I met them a long, long time ago. But on the question of Israel-Palestine, the German left, or a large bulk of it, was very clear. So what you describe is really a 80s, 90s syndrome.
Exactly. So what happens after the reunification of Germany is you have two developments. On the one hand, you have people and the far right really starting to burn down homes of refugees, starting to really proclaim, "Wir sind das Volk," we are the people, in a very nationalistic way, leading to various refugee homes of asylum seekers burning down in Lichtenhagen, in Solingen, and other places. And at the same time, you have Germany's political elite buying into this new national discourse. And so for many young activists on the left, it became a point of honor to be anti-German, anti-Deutsch, that we refute this kind of Germany. And what happens is that this tendency inside of the German extra-parliamentary left grows from strength to strength throughout the 1990s. Given the weakness of the left, the collapse of the left worldwide after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they act as the anchor of the German left, because they say this is the way that German imperialism is reconstituting itself. German nationalism is on the rise inside of Germany. And so the anti-Deutsche become the dominant, by the early 2000s, become a really dominant player inside of the German left. The flip side of that is, as you rightly point out, is the weakness of the anti-war movement when it comes to the war in Afghanistan, when it comes to the war in Iraq. Actually, you see the kind of dichotomy where the German left said, well, the Islamists are to be equated with fascism, and so under the guise of humanitarian intervention, under the guise of women's rights, the arguments really carried a lot of weight inside of the German left as well.
I was at a platform in Berlin with Daniel Cohn-Bendit, a prominent leader of the left, of the Greens, and anarchist in '68, and he said to me bluntly in my ear, he said, "You see, Tariq, in order to oppose the war in Iraq, we had to support the war in Afghanistan." And I started laughing. I just laughed. I mean, there was nothing else to say. But forgetting that for a moment, let's just have one last question, Mark, which is the European Union. Now, people imagine that the whole of Germany is totally committed to the European Union, etc., etc. It's the heart of the European Union. Yet there is a great deal of criticism of the European Union within Germany itself, for good and bad reasons. But the elite still seems totally committed.
What we have seen is that the European Union is the proxy through which German foreign policy and German European politics is conducted, because, as I mentioned before, it's actually too small to act solely on its own, and the European Union gives it a way of pursuing its economic policies as well as political hegemony inside of Europe. Inside of Germany, what we have seen is that criticisms have become loud, more from the right side, from the far right of German politics, rather than from the left against the European Union, because the left continues to see oftentimes the European project as transcending the national state. National states are a thing of the 20th century. The European Union is the future. The brotherhood of Europe is the way forward. And so the left has bought into a lot of the ideas surrounding the European Union. The way that Habermas, for example, used to speak about Deutschmark nationalism has been overcome because we now have the euro. So these ideas have gained a lot of strength and remain very strong. However, on the right, what we see is the way that the European Union, similarly as in Britain, is conflated with immigrants coming over, open borders, and so the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, and other forces in the side of the CSU, the Bavarian section of the CDU, have played on these fears of people against the European Union, and in particularly the discourse surrounding those bureaucrats in Brussels. However, I think the vast majority of the German population continue to support Germany's role inside of the European Union, as well as the way it has dealt with Greece, for example. So
that's popular.
That is popular. So you see Schäuble ranking as the most popular politician in Germany at the moment, whereas he's detested in the rest of Europe. You see Angela Merkel being the second most prominent and popular politician in Germany.
But that, funnily enough, all this sort of Europhilia aside, that is a deeply nationalistic way of looking at it, isn't it?
Because it is advancing German interests,
yes.
After all.
Whereas in the rest of Europe, increasingly now, because of the way in which the mask has come off and what they've done to Greece, people are getting very critical of Europe. Leading commentators here now, in The Guardian, for instance, are calling for the left to organize against Europe.
Until recently, it's really been the case that Germany has pursued the strategy of European integration in order to create a supranational state. The introduction of the euro meant that it had a political tool in order to control the different European states, but also an economic tool in terms of devaluing its very own currency in order to gain export strength. That's a very important kind of dimension to it. The second one is that it has continuously used the institutions of Europe in order to gain strength outside of its sphere of influence. So if you look at the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, it's actually a German-American plan.
Yeah.
And they're using Brussels and the European institutions in order to ram new trade agreements down the throats of the new member states of Eastern Europe, of Greece, because so far 9 states inside of the European Union don't have free trade agreements with the United States, for example. And so Germany is using those institutions. And so actually, the euro as well is part of the edifice of German imperial politics and of the German ruling class and the way that the German ruling class will continue to advance in coming years, I believe.
Mark, thanks very much. We'll resume this conversation.
Thank you very much, Tarek.
Bye.